Howdy, folks. I'm Caleb Keller, and welcome to Influ-Men-Sirs, the podcast where we explore influential men and their influence on men and the broader conversation around masculinity as a whole. I'm a therapist based in Portland, Oregon, specializing in men's issues, trauma, and neurodivergence. Today, we will be discussing John Mark Comer, the former teaching pastor at Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, and the writer-creator of the Practicing the Way book and curriculum, a course designed to assist Christians in embodying the life rhythms and teachings of Jesus in a tangible way. With me, as usual, are my fellow Influ-Men-Sirs. Evan Merculia.
Hello, I'm Evan. I'm a pastor in the Northwest.
Awesome. And Nick Bice.
Hey, I'm Nick. I am an IT professional, also in the Pacific Northwest, work remotely from home. Greatest gig I've ever had.
Awesome. All right. So for further clarity around our show today, while Influ-Men-Sirs is neither a theological nor Christian podcast outright, many of the guests on our show and myself are people of faith. As such, speaking to influential men within the Christian space is of vital and particular importance to us. However, while theology and Christianity will obviously be discussed today, the primary purpose of our discussion today will be focused on John Mark's direct and indirect conceptions on masculinity, particularly Christian masculinity, and how his influence within Christian culture therefore influences male culture within Christianity as a whole. Disclaimer aside, before we dive in, I thought I'd give a brief overview of the fellow we have in mind for today. So I thought I'd quote Comer directly from his own website and self-description. So again, this is not me. I am just reading his website blurb. I'm a teacher and writer. For nearly 2 decades, I was the founding pastor at Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon. We spent many years working out discipleship to Jesus in the post-Christian West and organized our community around a simple idea: practicing the way of Jesus together. In 2021, after leading a 5-year initiative around spiritual formation we called Practicing the Way, I stepped away from my role to create simple, beautiful formational resources for church communities around the world. Today, I'm developing new practices, courses, and podcasts for Practicing the Way and living in Topanga Canyon, California, with my wife T and our 3 kids. I'm also the New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, including my newest manifesto, Practicing the Way, the best-selling Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, and Live No Lies, God Has a Name, and Garden City. I hold a master's degree in biblical and theological studies from Western Seminary. It's my school. But these days, you'll find me out walking the oak groves of the Santa Monica Mountains working on my next project. End quote. So, as we tend to do when we start these podcasts and begin to discuss the fellow in question, we start real simple. What do we think about the fellow in question? Let us start with Nick.
All right, so I have some background with John Mark, not necessarily directly personally. I, in high school, started going to Bridgetown Church probably around 2013. So, oh gosh, that's 12 years ago at this point. And spent quite a bit of time there my senior year of high school, working with the youth pastor there at that time, and participating in a program there they had called Lead for developing up leadership within their church. So I spent a lot of time at, after school at the church office with the youth pastor. Every now and then would bump into John Mark, kind of had that level or air of inaccessibility back then. And then after I graduated, kind of went off to do Multnomah and do my undergrad, stopped going to that church as much, and then came back to Bridgetown in either 2020 or 2021. we came back to that church, my wife and I together. Um, and my overall impression with him has been generally positive. He was kind of one of the people who, in that early part of my faith journey, helped me realize that you can, like, there was more depth to following Jesus than what I was told or what I saw in the broader Christian subculture around me and in the church that I grew up in. That there was academic rigor to be found, that there was intellectual depth to the scriptures and to theology that uh, answered, not necessarily answered a lot of my questions, but addressed them at the very least. So for most of my life, I've had a very general positive view of John Mark.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Evan, what you got?
Pretty similar, actually. Overall positive for the most part. I think with this guy, maybe out of most of the podcasts, the three of us might have quite a different level of familiarity than other influential men, just because we've all spent time in Portland. So it's kind of similar for me. I started attending Bridgetown in 2018 when I moved to Portland. And I think Bridgetown's kind of the church in Portland that if you're a Christian and you live in Portland, you know about Bridgetown. And so I immediately had someone invite me to go there for a service. And I was like, wow, what the heck? Their worship, so good. And I was immediately captivated by, I think they were going through the World, the Flesh, and the Devil series. And I was like, wow, the teaching, we'll kind of talk about types and personality in a little bit, but I think his teaching style really found me and matched with mine. And so I really enjoyed how he taught. There were still a lot of things about Bridgetown and about his teaching that I was kind of cautious of, coming up from like a pretty darn conservative upbringing. Things were very different at that type of church, but it grew on me, and I kind of would go and split time between two other churches, but since it was in the evenings, it was kind of nice. So yeah, I pretty much had a pretty positive perspective of him, and as the years have gone by, have kind of engaged quite a lot. I never served at the church like you did, Nick, but just have been a observer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like Evan is saying, it is very true as far as hypothetical Influ-Men-Sirs. This is the one where, like, hey, we've done a lot of field research. We're there in the trenches, you might say. We know quite a bit more about this case. So what I will say for myself, so I met Nick via this guy's church. So glad about that.
12 years ago, baby.
Yeah, dude, it's been quite quite a while. Glad that we touched base and still here. But what I will say, it's really interesting again that Nick is on, because I remember when I first moved to Portland, and similarly to both of what you guys have said, had plenty of angst about all things church. I still do. I think I always will, actually, as an aside. But regardless, I had a lot more. It was like a lot more raw, unfiltered angst at the time when I first came. And what was really interesting is I did not like him very much at first. I couldn't put my finger to it, but the vague idea that, again, I'm not throwing you under the bus, John Mark, I promise. But the 20-year-old self in me felt fake, he felt snobby, and he felt holier than thou. So that was kind of my impression. That was kind of my Evan. Again, he always throws me the personality softball. That's his role, I guess, with our thoughts. But that was, so to give a little bit of clarity maybe about myself, my own personality, and how it interacts with his. So I'm a type 4. So really quickly, for folks that don't know, this is not an Enneagram pod in the same way I mentioned before. It's not outright a Christianity pod, just another lens to look at things through, though. So for me, what really matters then, and frankly still quite a bit now, is authenticity, is genuine vulnerability. So I think when I first encountered him at that time, I wanted or was craving something that felt like it had authenticity, that felt like it had more genuineness, you might say. And again, that probably spoke more to me, not necessarily that John Mark at that time wasn't, but I didn't experience him that way at that time. But then fast forward a couple years, a lot of adventures, more like misadventures in my life, a lot of growing, a lot of developing. I come back to the church, I want to say in either 16 or 17. And for me, it was kind of like he was a different guy. When in reality, I'm sure I was growing a lot. I was changing a lot. I was healing a lot, truth be told. But what I think I really came to terms with, and you guys have both spoken to this, but there was an intellectual earnestness that I really admired. A lot of quotations, a lot of just deep, insightful clarity around scripture, around Jesus's teaching that, again, similar to what both have said, I didn't necessarily feel that growing up in my conservative Christian context. And then I think the other element that I'll probably keep speaking to, because shocker, a therapist is going to talk about emotions and feelings, but here we are. The church really heavily emphasized emotionally healthy spirituality. I was thrilled. At the time, I wasn't pursuing counseling. I was working in a school district, but going back to, my own personality, my own mode of being in the world, I'm kind of a hard on sleeve fellow. I really need spaces where emotions are accepted, where we can talk about life as it really is. And that was one of the things that when I came back and heard his teaching, it was really, really heady, but it also felt like it had a lot of heart too. So it kind of spoke to me in both lanes, which I really, really appreciated. And one last blurb I can say is just about what John Mark himself has said about his own personality, again, using the grid of the Enneagram. So he has talked about identifying with being a type 1. So type 1s are commonly called the reformer. There's another label that can sometimes be used called the perfectionist. I don't really like that. That has a negative stigma to it. I like reformer more. So that basic idea is a core motivation of wanting to be morally good in as many of the capacities as that filters through. It could be family, could be marriage, could be society, whatever it looks like. And sometimes you can have mixed motives, right? If you're in that unhealthy space, but in the healthy space, it's no, you're truly a moral or strive to be a moral, good person. So, kind of my next bit, and this is where it'll be a little bit interesting because I don't know if John Mark has necessarily spoken to masculinity quite as directly as other fellows in Christian spaces uh, might we might say. But regardless, I guess I'm curious. I'll throw this to you, Evan. But what would you say, whether directly or indirectly, you've observed Comer say about masculinity?
Um, I feel like there's like little bits and pieces that I would hear through preaching that would come up, but it's so hard to go back and find wherever that was. But it's never been super overt. I did mark out a little section in his Loveology book that I can read if you want. It's like a page or so. Um, and it kind of speaks, I guess, a little bit to how he was talking about it. It's on page 177 is when he starts. He says, it's confusing because we're caught in the cross currents of culture. One tide is saying that there's no difference between the sexes and is working overtime to emasculate men and at the same time to erase the feminine side of women. The other current, which is just as strong, is pressuring us to fit into all sorts of stereotypes which we don't relate to. And that's kind of what he spends the majority of this time talking about. Says, think of the saying, stop crying and be like a man. What's unmanly about crying? Does Jesus wept ring a bell? And be a man. What does that even mean? So he kind of gives a bunch of examples of that. He says, what if I don't relate to any of these things? I live in Portland, which I must admit isn't exactly the epicenter of masculinity. There are a lot of guys with beards, but other than that, it's pretty tame. And he talks about how Portland was, I guess, measured dead last in most masculine cities. Which I didn't remember when I read this.
It's like according to whose metric too.
Yeah, the metrics were like number of home improvement stores, steakhouses, hardware stores, sports teams, pickup trucks. You
All
know,
right.
the
Thank you, Fox
stereotype.
News Index.
Really funny. Um, and he kind of wraps this little section up. He's like, so this is what it means to be a man, going to Home Depot, eating red meat, driving a truck. Oh, and whatever happens, don't cry. Seriously. So he's giving commentary on the stereotypes and how that's. I think that's giving a window into how he's kind of like, we need to reject those, and he kind of says that outright, and then he goes into the feminine side as well. It's been a while since I read that book, but I found that. Um, but other than that, it's kind of hard. Part of what I said when I was talking just a second ago too is when I first started going to Bridgetown. Bridgetown kind of, I don't know if it began it, but it was a major role in a lot of deconstruction that I did. And they helped in a good way. I also had really positive community around me, which is like one of the driving factors to positive reconstruction. And I never fully walked away, but there's just a lot of stuff that I needed to break down. And some of that was like, I think I saw in the notes somewhere. I was like, oh, he talks a little effeminately. Not a dig at him whatsoever. It's just something that I don't know, as a guy I picked up, and I was like, that's a little interesting. My overly maybe conservative upbringing was also like, oh, this church is kind of flowery, like it's soft and not masculine. Like I just had those perceptions that I was taking in of the church. But again, I grew a lot. I had good friends around me, and at the bottom of a lot of it is what you mentioned also, Nick, is I heard this really robust teaching of there's depth to your faith of apprenticing under Jesus that really just shook me out of whatever stream I was in and was like, yeah, I'm not doing that. But I think I also deconstructed a lot of maybe my perceptions of masculinity through being there as well. So while it might not have been directly said or taught, things were caught in different ways of like, yeah, there are these stereotypes. Why do I have to think that has to be this way? And it ended up being pretty healthy for me.
Yeah, I mean, just further to that, kind of my experience with his, it similarly just kind of, it's more ephemera here and there, bits and pieces in sermons. There was never really like that passage you read out of Loveology. I went looking, I think I got rid of the book at this point, but like had it at one point. So I'm like, I was like, oh, if he spoke about masculinity in depth directly, it would have been in there. So I mean, there you have it. But yeah, just my impression, and I should say too, I have my impression while I was there, and then my impression in retrospect now that I am not. And now that he's not either. I mean, to be fair, he left too. Different reasons. But yeah, I would say like my analysis would be more that, like, he has this kind of understanding, like, of trying to say like, oh well, this side of culture says to do this, and then we have this super conservative element of the church that says no, we need to do this, but the real answer is somewhere in the middle. And that's kind of a continual theme, not just on this topic of masculinity, but like most anything with Bridgetown, that was kind of a recurring theme that I saw, was just kind of this, hey, we need to kind of split the difference in, granted, not everything, but in most hot button issues, especially when I was there, probably around the time Loveology came out. um the hot button issue at that point was still like, hey, are you going to be an affirming church or not? And so Bridgetown was adopting at that point this aesthetic of, I've been trying to think of the best way to phrase this, not progressive, but I would say a branding forward um, sort of aesthetic. So all the bulletins, when they still printed, they had really excellent graphic design, and the production quality of the music was very, very high level and on par with, any commercial setting that you would be in any other way. So it's kind of made this, while I was there the first time, this kind of move towards engaging the concept of church as a business, or as a corporation, or this kind of corporate understanding. Like not corporate as in like what we would understand in a theological world, but in the corporate America style world. So we have branding standards. We, do things in these specific kind of workflows and ways. And so at that time when they kind of started moving in that direction, aesthetically, in the church, there was also a lot of discussion surrounding, again, like being an affirming church. And there was kind of this push and pull, it seemed at the time. And a lot of people who were very critical would have said, oh, you're just fence sitting. And that's something I think I heard a lot on the internet at that time about Bridgetown and about John Mark and his preaching. Now, I don't, knowing many of the people very well on staff at that time, I don't think that was their intention to be like, oh, well, it's like, bait and switch people with like really cool, graphic design and audio engineering and all this stuff. And then kind of hit them with this, oh, but we thought you would be more kind of liberal, democratic, neoliberal, popular culture, world order, whatever, that the branding might convey. They would kind of have that kind of aesthetic on the outside, but then you come in, hear the sermons, it's like, oh, he's not really saying anything that different, at least on the issue of sexuality, than what we've heard, for the last 30 years. He did, however, try and mediate a more compassionate approach to the issue, which is something that I think was greatly needed, and something that I think, whether it was John Mark in particular, and now this does go back to the issue of masculinity as well, but whether he was kind of the catalyst for this or just part of a broader movement in the American church as a whole that moved the conversation away from, again, on the issue of, like we say, like LGBTQ issues, from being like, oh, that's bad and wrong, you should feel ashamed, you're going to hell, to like, well, it's still bad and wrong. However, we love you and we don't want to be rude to you or mean to you. And I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but taking kind of we're going to not necessarily change the theological position, but we're going to change the way we engage. And so Preston Sprinkle is another big person in that movement, as well. He put out a book, People to Be Loved, that was very much down that, like, talks about that explicitly. Similarly, I think on the issue of masculinity, because I think in a lot of senses, the issue of masculinity, as it's talking about, are you a masculine man or are you an effeminate man, gets brought up a lot in the context of sexuality as well. And I think John Mark kind of led this charge, at least from my perspective in Portland at that time, towards saying like, hey, on the issue of sexuality, I'm going to engage in a traditional theological stance, but in a compassionate or supposedly compassionate manner of engagement, which also made room for people in the church who were not traditionally masculine, men who were not, like what Evan quoted from the book. I like to drive a truck and eat red meat. The people that you would stereotype in those ways. He did seem to make room for that quite a bit, which is, I think, a positive of his overall influence at that time and in the evangelical movement, I would say, as a whole, probably.
Yes. There's so many things you took from there, but I have to hold on to one. But the thing that I think is kind of, as we were prepping for this and kind of again, one of the reasons I think I like talking about things through a personality lens is it can kind of help us see what we pay attention to, what we take notice of, right? And even in some of the podcasts I listened to him when he was talking about his own personality, it kind of informs so much of what we have talked about up to this point, right? So him coming from an angle of wanting to be per his own understanding and own working out of not only his faith, but, his understanding of being a leader, his understanding of being a father, of being a husband, of being all these things, was again trying to be morally good in however it's going to manifest in those capacities. One thing that I've kind of noted is he comes in and kind of starts to take, some attention or get famous right when another Pacific Northwest pastor was kind of, having a different kind of moment, we could say. And so who I'm referring to is Mark Driscoll. So he's going to have his own moment on this pod for sure. But one of the big things that was really apparent at his church at the time, at Mars Hill, was in the same vein that Nick was talking about as far as branding is concerned. They kind of branded literally opposite. Like couldn't be more like antithetical to the branding as far as who they were wanting to draw in particular. You got something,
True.
Nick?
I would say it true. This is just a quick interjection too, but this is something that I think merits examination. Is the aesthetics were very similar as far as kind of anything from the loading up to the website and seeing the graphic design and how the user experience on the website is to the flow of a service. Very, very similar.
Oh.
And so I think that's, obviously two very different messages on the concept of masculinity. But the aesthetics were very, very, very close.
Yeah, they have this same emphasis on production value, emphasis on we're going to be super duper good at this church thing, almost overwhelm you in essence. But where are the reason why the comparisons seem to draw so neatly, so directly, both Pacific Northwest, right? Both deeply unchurched areas, right? And spaces where I just thought it interesting, right, that he kind of talks about his work feeling like he is um, in the vein of speaking to a culture that is post-Christian, right? And one thing that I think as time has gone on, as political events have unfolded, and as certain unhealthy qualities of the American evangelical church, i.e., Christian nationalism, have kind of taken shape, have kind of taken form. In some ways, where John Mark and his specific influence, his specific capacity of what did it look like for him to be this masculine leader in the Pacific Northwest alongside when Driscoll was doing his thing, along when that started fading, was a similar emphasis on intellectualism, a similar emphasis on charisma, a similar emphasis on both being quite intelligent. But I think to Nick's point, it was way more compassionate, way deeper of an emphasis on emotionally healthy spirituality, which is a notion, but a series of books from a guy named Pete Scazzaro, yet another gentleman we might do in the future. But just this really healthy idea of how do we, when we do church, tend toward what's called spiritual bypass, which we're throwing all these terms, all these big $5 concepts. This one, essentially what it means is when people will use verses, when they'll use Christianese, when they'll kind of avoid real life interpersonal issues and throw a verse on it, or try to dismiss it outright without engaging what it is doing to their soul, right? What it is doing to their ego, what is kind of that tension in there. And what I really appreciated, or what I feel like kind of more indirectly was shown from John Mark and his leadership style and how he carried himself as a masculine man, was emphasizing to be a good Christ follower, you have to be emotionally healthy. Full stop. And for me, particularly now that I'm on this side of things, being a therapist, I of course like it. But I think at that time, as someone that was figuring things out, as someone that, Evan kind of mentioned earlier, goodness gracious, I had deconstructed quite a bit by that time. But what really helped me feel like I could really be Christian at Bridgetown was sort of being in a space where the pastor could talk about things so eloquently, like we've talked about before, but be really emotionally honest. Holding both of those things at the same time was particularly compelling to me. So, yeah. I'm about to pivot or switch gears here, unless there's anything you want to add, Evan, or any more you want to chime in, Nick.
Yeah, that I think that emotional honesty piece was pretty big. I know that I had gone maybe to Portland with a side quest of finding a perfect church, having come from a church that had a revolving door of pastors for a while. And obviously, the saying is, if you find a perfect church, leave, because there is not such a thing. But um, I think I caught a lot of what you're saying too. That emotional honesty. I didn't have the words for that then, and also this authenticity, like the fact that he spoke into issues and into topics in ways that obviously meet the culture of Portland, like the 40 and under kind of crowd that's there. We talked about the branding and stuff too. It's just the modern iteration of attractional church model. That's just a theme that's gone on since like the 80s. But um, yeah, I resonate with that emotional honesty too. I was like, wow, this is actually resonating with me in ways that I didn't think were maybe possible at church.
Yeah, I think it gave space for men that don't have the kind of bravado of a Driscoll. They're not. There may be some masculine trappings, like for example, for myself, I love hoops, right? And I love video games, and I love beer, and I love a lot of masculine trappings. But there are several others, especially when it comes to speaking in such a bombastic, borderline, if not always bullying manner, that never appealed to me, that always felt completely anathema. So to just hear from someone that was relatively soft spoken, that did sit on the fence, like Nick was talking about, which would sometimes bother me. But in other times, it kind of felt like I was like, you know what? Like, I kind of understand why he feels like he needs to sit on the fence. On the one hand, he wants to be honest to his own understanding of what the scripture is saying. But on the other hand, he understands that to speak bluntly and harshly and uncaringly to whole demographics is definitely missing the forest for the trees, you might say. Is definitely completely antithetical to so much of what Jesus taught. So him being able to articulate that and speak into that really well was hugely, hugely important for me. We are quite heady thus far, which I'm not surprised. Both of these guys, they know their stuff really, really well. And hey, Evan, he spoke about Preston Sprinkle. You text me about Sprinkle all the dang time. So here we go, bro. I told you. I told you. All right. So our next question is, what is his influence with men? And in particular, obviously, we kind of talk about Christian men or men that find themselves in church spaces, and particularly why. What you got, Evan? How do you want to head out this question?
It looks like you wrote just the description. I think maybe hits a bunch of what we've kind of circled back to a bunch. It's just that that non-alpha role model. And I don't know. I obviously have no clue whether that was intentional on his part, just part of his personality that he let come through in the pulpit and as he taught and stuff like that. Or if there was some. I mean, he wrote about it in his book to some degree, so I'd assume that there was some intentionality of kind of bucking those stereotypes. But I would guess that a lot of his influence on men was probably in that regard. And if I'm thinking back to the last time I was on this and we talked about Jordan Peterson, the very much the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, aim at something higher, even though that's super relative and vague. Um, that's more still that kind of conservative tasting brand of masculinity. Driscoll's like the extreme in that regard, along with some others. But even though Comer didn't probably, I guess, speak directly on masculinity, even the way that he taught about being a follower of Jesus, being a non-anxious presence is a phrase that I always remember him saying a lot. The soft kind of non-alpha presence. I think that teaching spoke into, I guess, at least how I saw myself acting out my masculinity as a follower of Jesus. I mean, over the years, it's not just him. Actually, it wasn't really just him. It was other people pushed me towards more of a um, grasping of a nonviolent stance in life. But that played a role for sure in how I see I mean, a lot of his teaching and that kind of soft, or Dallas Willard has a book called The Allure of Gentleness. That kind of idea really did play a lot into my understanding, and I think would play into a lot of understanding of other guys, helping them to feel more comfortable and not having to be that robust, gritty kind of man. Like you said, Caleb, there's a lot of things that I like that are in the masculine, quote unquote, categories, but finding my home in more of a nonviolent pathway, that's definitely not masculine at all, according to the boxes and the stereotypes. So he did play a role in that. And I think his teaching, though it's not overt in that regard on masculinity, definitely I think has that effect.
I think I'd agree overall. Yeah, like his influence was more implicit, I would say, than explicit. And, some of that might be, like Evan was saying, I think a lot of it is just he was honest about who he was, from a leadership position, which is something that, generally speaking, at that point in time, and I mean, even still, is pretty rare, to be that kind of open, and especially to be that open, but also to be like, have his kind of personality in that high level of leadership is not always the case from what I can see. And even often I would hear his own self-criticisms, about, like, oh, well, like, I'm a much better teacher than I am a pastor. I don't really know how I ended up in this pastor thing. I just started a church because I can preach, and now I have to pastor and I'm really bad at it. And that caused a lot of issues, that he himself would speak to. And I think that, especially even with the church, and as the church kind of grew to this immense size, this mega church level. Now, I say mega church by Portland standards, it is a mega church. It probably, by many standards, it is maybe still. I don't know how many people attend now, but like, it's not a Dallas Fort Worth, Crystal Cathedral style mega church. It's not that big, but it to grow to this, like, I'm writing New York Times bestsellers. I have this outsized influence, or I have this influence outside of my, I guess, God-given responsibility, or people who I am accountable to God to lead as a shepherd, right? We talk about the concept of a pastor, it's a shepherd. So he leads this role of pastor, but really fills the role of teacher more than anything else. And that was one of the things that I think he was very acutely aware of. And one of the reasons I think he eventually ended up stepping back and practicing the way. So in certain respects, like, that is, I think, an admirable kind of, as we've spoken repeatedly about, emotionally healthy way of leading, of recognizing one's own shortcomings, being open about them, even from the pulpit at times. And then at a certain point or another saying, hey, my time here, I think God is, calling me somewhere else, or whatever it might be. Now, there's probably debate to be had as to maybe that should have happened sooner. Maybe it shouldn't. Who knows? But I think that that's kind of as a whole, kind of speaks to the testament of, like, he does have on the concept of what does it mean to, like, be a man or be masculine and follow Christ. Because that's, I think, what he is going to be most concerned about in his life's work. I think he does a pretty good job of saying, like, hey, like, let's pump the brakes on a lot of what we would now probably call toxic masculinity. I think early on he identified a lot of those traits and characters within both society and culture, but also within evangelicalism as a whole, and addressed them not necessarily explicitly. He might have made some jokes during the sermon at those, at the expense of Piper or Driscoll or whatever it might have been. He might have made fun of, not like ruthlessly, but just made it a side joke during a sermon about like, oh, haha, I know I'm supposed to be whatever. I'm supposed to be this way, but like, here's how we're doing it, whatever. So it kind of creates this environment that is conducive to that um, level of openness, or I would say a wider understanding of masculinity is acceptable than what previously came before. And so I think that influence lasted definitely within the Portland Christian community. Now, very clearly, it seems, he has some level of pull, some motion outside of, well, he doesn't live in Portland anymore. Um, but like, has some motion in the broader conversation about following Jesus in evangelicalism specifically in the United States.
Yeah, I think the if we're going to talk about, influential moves that he did. So we had, mentioned Driscoll. I'm not sure exactly when it was starting to happen, but Carl Lentz had kind of just recently had his moment and some of his struggles at Hillsong. And there were a lot of these falls, very public falls of very influential, very charismatic, and generally speaking, well-spoken pastors. And so it was really interesting. Again, kind of like we talked about before, this is a situation where we can draw from our own research. This is not that conceptual. We, in our own ways, we were all kind of there to see some of how this unfolded. One thing that, like, to his credit, I felt like he always tried to dampen down, but which I felt was sometimes an unhealthy byproduct of his skill, of his influence, of his capacity, was a somewhat idolization of him within Bridgetown as a community, right? So again, for my money and what I noticed, I felt like he tried to do his part to try to push that down, to not lean into it too unhealthily, right? And this is where I think that his personality and the way he is in the world sort of was a boon to that, was really, really helpful for that. And I remember when he officially announced to, the congregates, hey, I'm going to be taking a step down. I feel like it's healthy for me. I feel like kind of the vision that I have for my life, my family's life, is sort of like we've been subtly talking about, that truly at heart, I think I'm more of a teacher. I don't know if I necessarily lend myself toward shepherding, kind of like you were saying before, Nick, that I really am probably best with the more heady or kind of like, sounds corny, but like lifestyle stuff regarding Christianity. I mean, that's kind of what practicing the way is, right? Um, but a lot of people were deeply shook. Like, this is actually something I'd be curious for y'all to talk about, but there was kind of this like, what? Like, everyone almost had this alarm around it, this concern about it, and sort of like um, even the murmurs afterwards, even kind of how people experience things afterwards. People were like, oh, I miss when, it was like this, when John Mark was teaching like this. And there were other elements too. People were nostalgizing about, when this guy was leading worship or when this guy was doing that. But there was this weird, when I was there, again, as a pretty faithful member of the church, I went there for like most Sundays. And I was concerned, where I was kind of like, guys, we're bigger than that charismatic teacher. Like, and I think that's why he did this, right? Like, this is kind of why he intentionally decided to opt out. And again, as we're talking about influence, for me, I'm kind of like, in the best sense, that's kind of a baller move. Like, so many guys in this setting with this acclaim, with how it was going, with how it was booming, they're not stepping down. Not a chance.
Yeah. I take maybe a little bit more of a cynical stance uh here. I think you're not wrong in that. I mean, even from the very first time I encountered Bridgetown, when it was not called Bridgetown, um, there was, this running joke. We changed our name from Solid Rock to a Jesus Church because we got too popular. I remember Josh Porter would, when that change happened, Josh was like, "Oh yeah, we changed it because we were getting too popular. Too many people were coming, and like just it was like a spectacle. And so like we changed the name so make us harder to find." Um, and that's like a half joke. I think it was something that they were very much aware of. They changed the name, obviously not just to throw people off on purpose, though that would have been awesome. Because it was, and I think still is, church tourism. They Bridgetown for the most part grows its congregation by pulling from other churches, generally speaking. And that's how I showed up there, right? Hey, my church kind of sucks. Uh, the guy who's preaching is not very good, or whatever. It's just like, hey, I'm from this small church. We have no production value. We got the music's kind of whatever. Like the guy sings out of key. The sermon is like, the guy is not whatever. But I go here. Whoa, it's amazing, right? And so the spectacle of Bridgetown um very much drew a lot of people, and mostly drew people, I would say. I mean, this is not even just a unique to Bridgetown phenomenon. This is any church like Bridgetown is kind of known to be this case, is like pulling mostly from other churches. Even half the people there are probably like, oh well, I just go here on Sunday nights, but my main church is over here. So it's like this weird kind of, there's not a whole lot of engagement. And this was something even I saw with like many of my friends who were on staff are like, oh yeah, like we have, of the people who are like, this is my home church, it's 20% maybe of the people who show up on a Sunday. Everybody else is kind of like is going somewhere else. So there was this kind of cult of personality that developed around John Mark from a pretty early stage, because, and that's not something I can't fault John Mark for being who he is and being good at being a teacher. That's not at all what I would say. Because just he's naturally gifted at that. He's a gifted communicator, a gifted, preacher. Well, depending on how a lot of like towards the end, I'm like, is this a sermon or is this a TED talk? But there was very much kind of a cult of personality that developed pretty early on around John Mark and his teaching, that at least my first stint of being there from the early mid 2010s, they were aware of and tried to mitigate as well as they could. The second time I came back, in 2021, 2020, whenever it was, it seemed like a lot of that kind of conversation, that like we have this presence of mind of, hey, there's this, we got to constantly fight this cult of personality. Like we got to make sure like this is not good. This is not healthy. We don't want this. That kind of seemed to be less of a concern at that point. And so the steps that might have been taken intentionally to kind of like beat that back, one of which early on was, I remember they said, hey, if you want to be part of our church, you need to live in Portland. You need to live west of I-205 and east of highway or wherever in Sylvan. You had to live within the Portland city limits and west of I-205. I remember when they did that, and that was pretty controversial. And they did that on purpose because of this kind of, we're becoming the spectacle. People are just coming to hear this teaching, and like and on top of that, no one's really engaging, staying connected, engaging in community, whatever. It's just kind of this hyper commuter sort of consumeristic engagement. And so seeing that kind of intentional, like, hey, we're going to try and kick a bunch of people out. Now, that's a very crude way of putting it, but basically saying like, hey, go to your local church. Like, we like you. We can't force you to not come, but this is not good. We don't want this to be our, identity and legacy. And they were very open about that at that time. And that did not really seem to be the case as much as time went on. They did talk about like, oh, well, we know we got a lot of people who come here from Vancouver. So we're maybe thinking of like starting a church there. And then Van City Church kind of got planted and they would say, oh, you should go there. And then there wasn't, from my perspective, really a whole lot to say beyond that. People still came to Bridgetown instead because they liked John Mark. And there was not like hey, we need to have a sit down with you. Like, this isn't healthy. Like, yes, we understand you like this person and their teaching, but that's not what church is supposed to be. You need like a more robust ecclesiology, whatever. So as time goes on, I feel like that kind of the guardrails surrounding cult of personality, power and influence, sort of kind of go away. Or I don't want to say go away entirely, but they're severely limited. Whereas early on, that was something, because of all of these high profile falls from grace, was really, really at the forefront of a lot of the leadership, from my understanding. Was saying, hey, we got to make sure that this is not something that we don't want this for our church. We don't want this to be our legacy. We care about human beings and we want them to follow Jesus well. And in order to do that, we need to fight against X, Y, and Z. And so those safeguards were put in place. And I feel like that kind of, the focus on those safeguards kind of went away as time.
What you got, Pastor Evan?
Yeah, the cult of personality stuff is really challenging, especially for other churches. I know, just as an anecdote, we were running a program for a couple of years, and there was a guy that would come up from Portland. I have no clue actually why he was coming up. He wasn't part of the leadership of the program we were doing, but he mentioned that he's like, oh, I help lead such and such church in Portland. And I was like, oh, is that on whatever, X street? He's like, yeah, how'd you know that? I was like, well, my in-laws live like 5 minutes from there. He's like, oh, cool. I was like, yeah, I used to live there. I went to Bridgetown, and there was this immediate like, he's like, ah. And he ended up telling me, he's like, a lot of people from his church had left his church to go to Bridgetown. And I've since brought in a lot of practicing the way stuff at our church, and it's not easy to introduce to a church that is not built around the cult of personality of John Mark Comer. And I started going to Bridgetown pretty late in the game as far as his tenure goes. And so it was very well developed at that point. And it was very easy to get the church to go along with, kind of where he was driving at. And having gone back through and read all of Willard's stuff, he's pretty much drawing almost entirely from Dallas Willard's body of work, which is great. He put his own spin on many things, but that is, so cult of personality of John Mark Comer, cult of personality of the spiritual formation movement, kind of one and the same a little bit. But there's another church in Australia. I remember listening to a podcast on this guy talking about, oh, we did this 40-day fast before the election, and everybody shut off their technology and didn't, and it's this big church. It's like, how in the world do you get a whole church to go along with that? Well, they've already built up a culture around either a leader or a certain movement or style, and so everybody's bought into it. Whereas if you try and transplant one thing into a completely different culture or church, it's a lot harder. We've had good success with practicing the way. It's been really fun, but obviously it's not like, oh, all our communities are doing it and all this kind of fun stuff and everything. So cult of personality is really, really a big thing. And that's a very difficult thing, I think, maybe with some of the outlook of, hey, how long can this last? Because eventually he's going to step down and that cult of personality is going to be gone. And people are going to be like, oh, I don't really want to go there anymore. And I mean, I've been a lot less interested in Bridgetown since he left, if that says anything. I listened to the Comer Teachings podcast. I've read Staten's books to just see what they're interested in. I've listened to some of his preaching. It's not really my style, so it just never picked up on me. But yeah, the cult of personality thing is pretty big, so it leaves a big impact on a church for sure.
I think you both are kind of speaking to maybe the way like Christian influence is very complicated. Is very in some of the pods that I had sent y'all. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to them, but some of them it was with another fellow who was a mega church pastor who I really like. His name is Mike Erie. Anyway, they ended up being friends and they know each other pretty well. Um, but he kind of talks, specifically Mike, talks a lot about how when you get to this big level, it really like distorts your soul. Like it just does something insidious and kind of just subtle that, I mean, in the one vein, I think it's appropriate for us to speak to its limitations and its unhealth, and even speak to how someone like John Mark or Erie in his tenure, or you know Driscoll or Lentz or any of these fellows, any ones that we might even like that seem to be healthy. What is it about these church contexts that tend to get to this big level that form men the way that they do, right? So in this instance, forming John Mark the way that it did, to the point that, like I was kind of saying before, I thought it was really valuable and important that he stepped down, like as a move, as a resistance to the sort of consumeristic pull that evangelicalism just has organically in its DNA. That's just kind of what do you got, Nick?
So from my perspective, I see his stepping down. Like, yes, I think, oh, hey, I'm getting this outsized influence outside of the church. Maybe I should step down because this, whatever cult of personality, yeah, maybe not be great. There's also something to be said for this perspective of, oh, look at all of this growth that I'm getting, the influence and power that I'm getting in all of these stages outside of the church. I can't grow that if I'm worried about the church. So I'm going to go start my own nonprofit. And now it's all about me. So there is that to be said too, where it's like, okay, now practicing the way, it's not a church, right? It's like, okay, it's a nonprofit. We're doing this for the benefit of churches, but it's like, it's John Mark. Like it is very much like, this is John Mark. This is my teaching. This is my legacy. It's not really necessarily that overt, but implicitly that's kind of, what we get. So
I mean, I think that's really fair. I'll say my little piece, Evan, and then you go. But it's really valid, right? You can look at it from both lenses, and it's probably true that he did it for both reasons, right? Where it was like, on the one hand, healthy call, step down, blah, blah, blah. But then at some level, some degree of self-interest, some degree of, and I think maybe the only other bit that I think I would want to add to it is sort of going to the whole idea of emotional health is maybe, and I since I don't have that level of influence, since I don't know what it's like to occupy spaces with that much attention and notoriety, just some version of more transparency, more awareness, or putting it front and center about maybe not even necessarily what the toll is like, but sometimes even the spiritual bypassing language you'll hear from the pulpit when we're talking about, oh, the church is moving in this way, or oh, we're wanting this, or oh, we're wanting that. I mean, this is something that I think in my time at Bridgetown, I would always pretty much tune out the moment they started talking like this, which was, look at how big this church is. Look at how the movement is coming. Look how many people are doing this. Look how many people are doing that. To another shout out of the guy that I've already mentioned that I really like, Mike Erie. One big thing that he'll say is, are we faithful or are we effective? That I'm like, ooh, okay. You could apply that to a lot of different angles when it comes to church stuff, when it applies to maybe what happens to men that find themselves in these spaces and how it kind of distorts their own sense of humanity, their own sense of self. But what you got, Evan?
I was just thinking, I had that exact kind of conversation that you were describing, Nick, with someone when he made that decision, because I'd already moved away by then. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, he's talking about how he wants to kind of protect the church, basically, that he's shepherding from the potential of a fall from grace. And those falls from grace are always so weird to us because we're baffled. Like, how could you even fall for those traps? It's just crazy. But it's kind of almost like politics. Like, the system that someone is put into ends up is what doing damage to the person. Um, but the counter in this conversation I had with the person, the counter was also, um, well, if he's worried about sin working its way in the pulpit from this heightened influence, leaving to go do this practicing the way thing does not take that away whatsoever. He's still the best all-time best-selling author on the New York Times. He's still very widely known. He just caught some heat for endorsing Andrew Valera's book on penal substitution. Like, he's still out there, so he's still very known. That does not take away the possibility of sin. So there's definitely two sides of it.
Okay. Tech difficulties aside, folks. There's something to the effect of how social media, algorithms, rage baiting, and all things related to fame, to virality, to getting things to become bigger, more influential, more famous. There is just this quality of how it forms not only John Mark and his masculinity, right? One of the main points of this pod, right? But also my masculinity, also Evan's, also Nick's. There is something about how we're drawn to these larger than life figures, right? And in this space, all of us being people of faith, talking about a guy that's, famous in our faith. I just think that there is something concerning or alarming, maybe, that has suddenly emerged as we've been talking today, where we know he's a good teacher and we know a lot of what he has to say is really sound, right? So, in other words, if you go and practice, the way as he self describes, right? And do a lot of those practices and disciplines, even, like Evan has been alluding, he's literally teaching at his church. Good will come of it. You will likely feel closer to God. You will likely, or hopefully anyway, become a more loving, caring, godly person, bear the fruit of the Spirit, all that good stuff. But maybe what we're circling here is the sort of deformative way that having celebrity in a faith space, specifically where the person that we are following, the person that we call Lord, he seemed to have particular inklings about fame, about how to resist, about the kind of false allure of the crowd, or at least how it can be sort of distorting to you. So I guess with this in mind, and kind of, and fellas, we're getting kind of negative, we're getting kind of dark, but no, it's truthful, which is kind of the main point of what we want to do here. Nick's got something. What joke you got?
I just you invited me on the podcast.
It's true.
Got a little
It's true.
dark.
I know deep down it's because you care a lot. That's why.
True.
That's it.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I didn't care,
That's
I would have nothing to say.
Yes, precisely. But in that same vein, right, and in this very interaction that he and I just had, right, our last question that we tend to have on this pod is, how has this person's work, this person's life, all these things that we've been talking about, how do they affect our own masculinity, our own conception of what it means to be a man, what we struggled with in the past, what we're struggling with now, right? What felt encouraging then, what it feels encouraging now. So maybe let's kind of send this off with you, Nick, because you've been having that harshness. I've got I've got to force you to be positive, or maybe not even positive, but just, speak to both sides. But yeah, tell me what you got.
Yeah, so me is a famous both sideser. Um no, I would say I kind of like what I started out with. Um in reflection, I think John Mark's work has been very influential in my life as a whole and in my own conception of what it means to be, I guess, a man following Jesus, right? That's, he was one of the first people I encountered that, spoke to the intellectual curiosity and hunger that I had. Obviously I went and did a double major at Multnomah University, and then we got a Master of Divinity immediately afterwards. And I was gonna do a PhD, and then COVID happened, and then maybe that will still happen at some point. Who knows? But anybody listening to this, do not hold me to that, please, for the love of God. It's a lot of work. That kind of you know understanding that, like, oh, I can be somebody who follows Jesus, and I don't have to be whatever these, like, I don't have to be like, when I was in high school, it's like, oh, to be a man, to have people respect me, I'll join the army. I'm going to be an army ranger. I'm going to be, whatever, like this very hyper masculine, like, if I go kill people overseas, then like I'm a real man. Someone will respect me. It's like, no, you don't have to do that. In fact, probably please don't do that. But you can be a fully secure in your masculine essence person, um and follow Jesus without having these, what, cultural trappings that we would put around masculinity. So you can be like intellectually curious, you can be in touch with your emotions, you can be, willing to, and not even just willing to, just be like, oh, I'm overwhelmed, I'm going to cry, or whatever, in public. Oh my god. And so that is something that I think will forever be uh, carried with me. Even in spite of, I think, towards the latter half of John Mark's, or maybe not even, I don't know if I would split it into a half, but the latter part of his time at Bridgetown, I started encountering kind of what I would describe as kind of a more I don't I don't want to say regression, because I don't know where he started from, but a move towards a more right-wing political ideology that started to seep through in his teachings that I didn't notice was there before. Now, maybe it's just I moved, but I distinctly remember a time right before he left, um, where he started talking about how he was bringing his son to visit this high school, the high school that, was his neighborhood high school that he would go to as a freshman next year. And how when he was touring the high school, he saw this quote on the wall from Michel Foucault. And immediately he was like, I can never send my son here. Like, this is like, look how bad our culture and society is that they've got a quote from Michel Foucault. Like, he just overreacted. And then I was like, hey, man, that's my high school. I went there. I know those teachers. I know the people who are there. They're amazing. They acted more like Christ than many of the people in the church that I grew up in. Like, so I started seeing these kind of culture war elements start coming out at that time. And then since he has left Bridgetown, I've seen that kind of come up repeatedly in his talks about deconstruction, kind of very negative in how he reacts to that, which is kind of interesting, as we talked about how he kind of pioneered a very sensitive, caring approach to discussing the issue of sexuality in his ministry context. The issue of deconstruction, he's been a little bit less than sensitive in how he's spoken about. And so seeing all it's kind of one of those, like, oh wow, like, don't meet your heroes. Well, I mean, that's the other thing, is like, he was always pretty inaccessible. So even if I wanted to get a meeting with him, I couldn't. Another problem with mega churches was, there's that. But I think having that legacy as a whole, those are the kind of the two things that I take away from him. His work in his life has affected me both positively in its affirmation of certain elements of, like, yes, you can follow Jesus and be, You can be a man who follows Jesus and not have to look this kind of way. You can be into whatever, there's no like trappings or hard mold that you must fit into. And then also in a negative way, I see here's how these positions of power and influence corrupt people. And also, like, I don't want to be like this. This is something I disagree with. And I appreciate that example as something that I can say, hey, that's not great. I don't like this. Want to move away from it. So, I have the both. There you go. I've got the both sides of it for you. So it's a mixed bag at the moment, but there's that initial, I would say, formative part of my life that is very, very indebted to what he did at that specific point in his life as well. So
Very nuanced. Appreciate it. What you got, Evan?
I'm going to make a comparison to a conversation that I had and have heard from a lot of people. And as it has gone with really big fans of Charlie Kirk, I've heard a lot of people say, he was me. This like statement, he was me. Maybe it was the person, or maybe it was the symbol, to use Mike Erie's kind of language that he uses. I don't know. But you find something very representative in this other person of like, oh, so much of what you're saying, how you're saying it, the way you're acting it out, I just can relate to, and like I've been missing. I would say in a much healthier way. That's kind of how John Mark Comer was for me in a lot of ways. I especially as I have moved into being a pastor, I know that maybe another good comparison as being a musician. There are drummers that I really like and watch a lot of. I don't really ever make a concerted effort to drum like those drummers, but I do. It just happens. It's just osmosis. Same thing with preaching. I don't make a concerted effort to preach like John Mark Comer or to preach like, anyone else I listen to, but you absorb those things. And so like the ways that he would, I think kind of talk about sexualism and how big of a problem that has been in the church for so long, all of America's history, actually. I heard that and was like, oh, like I love the highly intellectual side of the faith. And I've felt demeaned for expressing that. I was, oh, that resonates with me. And so in all the things that he did, preaching wise, specifically as this example, even writing, actually, even the way that I learned to then write manuscripts was kind of how he write. Like he writes in like these really short paragraphs, one little line, one word kind of thing. It looks like how someone talks is the way that I picture it. That's how I write now. And it helped on a practical sense. It's easier to keep track of when you're reading a manuscript at a pulpit, but again, osmosis. And so the way that he also, as this all relates to masculinity, the way that he acted out being a male pastor, I kind of caught by osmosis and saw that there was a very emotionally healthy way to do this. And not every male pastor has to be the Craig Groeschel with the big biceps, or thing like that. Or you don't always have to be the Carl Lentz with the hipster glasses, or the John Piper in a really more conservative, or MacArthur, really conservative church, or, there's always these images, especially, as someone who's going into pastoral ministry, there's always these images of like, oh, that's what a pastor is. And again, as we've talked about, he's spoken to bucking the stereotypes of masculinity so much that that's going to be part of the thing you catch as through osmosis, looking into being a pastor myself. So that probably had some of the biggest impact on me. And the way that we're even talking about how he talked on masculinity is hard for someone who didn't really actually speak to it very much. Like you said, Nick, you called it like it's implicit. And so it's harder for us to kind of name and put the actual fingers on the button and the pulse of what was the masculinity that he was talking about. And so some of the phrases of the non-alpha kind of thing, the rejection of stereotypes, like that's what I think shined through the most. But Again, I can't point to like specific things that he talked about masculinity that I'm like, oh, that's what I want to also emulate as a pastor as well. It's just things I picked up. And again, as we talked about personality and the Enneagram, I don't know if you said that he's a one, or he said that he's a one. The times I've taken the test, I'm a one. So if I'm going to use that language, then that would make sense why I would catch on to a lot of how he does pastoring as a man. Um, I think his authenticity as a man from the pulpit was really compelling. The fact that you can talk about yourself and your struggles is something that I do actually try to be really intentional about. Whether it's talking about pornography in front of the whole church, so that other men in the church can know that this is a safe place to talk about your struggles with pornography. And maybe, I don't know how long ago, but certainly when I was in high school, as a man, you don't talk about those things because that's weakness. And yeah, I mean, it's a roundabout way of saying, as a pastor, watching another pastor and the ways that he expresses masculinity, those things do catch on. You catch those things.
I definitely think so. I mean, I think that um, speaking for myself, or the ways in which I felt affirmed or not affirmed in my masculinity, per what he taught and how he carried himself. I mean, very much like, this is something really, really subtle. But we kind of hinted at him, in his speaking, and maybe a bit in how he carries himself, of carrying somewhat of an effeminate edge. Um, I myself have had some struggle in the past of having a higher, more nasally sounding voice, and just some of the insecurity that I carry at times because of that. But then to hear someone who, again, had a little bit of that effeminate quality, but spoke really, really well, would, like, have a bunch of dudes at the church with the beards, with the, masculine trappings, that were in the front row, eating up what he had to say. Like, that to me, I found really compelling. And at the same time, kind of feeling, well, like I've mentioned several times, of course, the therapist says this, but still, just the importance of emotional health and how that ties to spirituality. I really strongly disliked so much of the Christian culture I was brought up in, precisely because it was emotionally unhealthy to the nth degree. It was very much about keeping up with appearances, keeping up with the Christian Joneses. And I think, speaking to part of what Nick has been talking about on and off throughout today, is just, I agree that part of what I, in some ways, don't want to carry, or am sort of feeling distant from, is where that he in the past kind of sat on the fence and maybe did so in a way from a compassionate posture. There has been a little bit more of what I experience almost as, like, jaded, or maybe jaded is too strong a word, but just a bit of a smugness. Again, like Nick spoke to, when he speaks to deconstruction, when he speaks to a lot of people's experience of, there may be plenty of folks that have walked away from faith for what we would say would be less than legitimate reasons, right? I can't know that. Nobody can really know that, right? But what I can say is that if we don't have a compassionate posture toward people that are feeling hurt, or are feeling like the church is not a safe space for them, again, I feel like we're missing the forest for the trees. I just can't more strongly feel frustrated by that, concerned by that. And, another thing that I kind of mentioned is, in a lot of ways, prior to the slight more bent to the right, I would get a little annoyed at some of the apoliticalness of it all, or at some of the both sides, so to speak, right? We're in a moment in time where Christian nationalism on the ideological right is deeply corrupting the Christian faith. Like, let's just call a spade, right? And I think that if we can't just speak really directly to that and denounce it at every turn, and very cleanly and succinctly state, this is not the way of Jesus, with some version of regularity, I'm really concerned. Because if we're in bed with the empire, if we're in bed with the political status quo, than a lot of what Jesus taught, of how Jesus kind of hoped that we would influence our world, is kind of at jeopardy. It is kind of, it makes a lot of people feel like it's somewhat fraudulent if you're not like one of those, Christian nationalist types, but you're not speaking against that. Now, whether that's because you don't want to lose money or you don't want to lose influence or you don't want to lose whatever, I can't know. This is maybe where I'm taking a little bit from Nick and some of my cynicism is coming out a little bit. But I think at the end of the day, we have to, in the best sense, reclaim how healthy Jesus following. It's not that it's apolitical, it's more that it's almost always politically very aligned with the marginalized, with the down and out, with the people that are being taken advantage of, whoever that may be. So at times when that some of that both sides or that kind of being on the fence or now swinging a little to the right, for me, I kind of feel like it feels like it's a waste. It feels like it could really healthily advocate for a lot of people, a lot of communities, a lot of spaces that are really struggling and that need godly men to speak directly into it in spite of the pushback. So that's my TED talk, my sermon, my whatever. You guys are one of the pastoral types. I'm not. I'm a therapist. Don't get mad at me. All right. Whoever goes next. I don't know if someone else wants to chime in, but
I think you're spot on in terms of your analysis about Christian nationalism and I mean, this is it's a whole separate podcast episode to discuss that and the concepts of masculinity that are associated with that. You look at like Joel Webben and all these people who, like, I'll just be flippant, like, just don't know who Jesus is. They don't have a relationship with the living Christ. Like, just very clearly, they don't know Jesus. They don't know the love of God. They don't have it in them for their brothers who are Christian anyway. Like, anybody within their Christian faith, they don't even love their fellow Christians well enough, let alone people outside the church. It's just very, very clearly like, okay, that fruit's very rotten. You don't have to get into like a really long debate about it. It's just very obvious. It's like 1 + 1 = 2 kind of stuff on a lot of that. Uh, that being said, uh, you got to go deeper. This isn't a new phenomenon. Right? Like, this is something that goes back to the moral majority, the religious right, like these movements, beginning like with Nixon in the 60s. You have to go back to like Billy Graham's Crusades and kind of the alignment Billy Graham did with political power at the time. And that's kind of, I think, ties in very well with what we're talking about with, you know, cult of personality and in church and mega church world, whatever. It's this concept of like power runs counter to the gospel of Christ. The power of this world runs counter to any Christian social ethic that we run into. So obviously we have this problem where we live in the world that we live in. So we're going to encounter power structures. We're going to have to live underneath them, engage in them, and be part of them to some level or degree. Now, what matters in those respects, as you know, people who follow Jesus, as somebody would say, how do I like make my masculinity align with, that of Christ, or what, depending on how you want to take a look at that. You have to reject power in a lot of senses, or in your position where you're given power, it is very important to give it away, as the model of Christ. In like, look at the concept of like kenosis, in Christian theology. But all that to say, like, there is like, I just want to caution, there is that long history. This is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been going on for decades. And some, like, a project that's been built intentionally. over those decades, where like maybe we grew up and it was not obviously nearly as overt in a lot of the public square as it is now. You didn't have people being like, yes, actually, we should start doing public executions of Muslims on the street. And that is a good thing. And we should be happy about that. It's like, okay, that was like people would say like, yeah, no, don't say that. But like deep down, maybe in the back of their mind, they'd be like, yeah, okay, but maybe we could get there. So when we address like, how John Mark or like this concept of a masculinity, in the vein of Christianity and church leadership and stuff that engages politically, and needs to, that we do live in a time of urgency that needs to address these sorts of things very directly, very explicitly, and I would say very forcefully denounce them. We also have to keep in mind that context, that this is not new, that there are a lot of money and a lot of decades behind it too, which I'm sure you both know, but something that I had to bring up, I would say.
Yep. Definitely a lot of time behind that stuff. Even pre-American government, the Christianity in America became democratized within 2 seconds. We can study history, and it's been there the whole time. Honestly, the 4th century was when Christians were handed the sword. That's when nationalism started for them, and it's just been an ongoing thing for so long. But the only thing that really crossed my mind, as a pastor who has now been in the role through COVID and Charlie Kirk, um, is there's obviously an expectation from the church for the pastor to say something about cultural and political issues. Um, we don't have much guidance on that from Scripture, on should a pastor do this or not do that, because the role that pastors play now didn't exist back then. So it's kind of hard to be like, oh, well, Jesus was pretty silent on the raging political issues of his day, to quote Comer. So should we be as well? Not really, because people are suffering and people are hurting, and it's pretty New Testament constitution to, be looking out for them. So it is hard. It's also not easy with how fast events happen and come up. The difficulty with which it is to find accurate information, to know that the sources that you're listening to are accurate or giving you true information. All that to kind of say, have a little bit of grace on your pastors who don't immediately make a definitive stance on an issue. Give them a little bit of time because, well, to quote Sprinkle, the strength of my opinion should match the depth of my research. And I would hate to make a definitive stance on something that happened yesterday to my church, who's looking to me for leadership, and not just be wrong, but be somewhat spiritually damaging. And so it's not easy to hold that space and to look out at my congregation and know that there are people on so many different sides of an issue. And yeah, there's boldness to stand on things that are obvious, like you're saying, Caleb, like Christian nationalism. We have to be that prophet in the wilderness calling Israel back to her faithfulness to God in this regard with Christian nationalism, because it has perverted our witness to this country. And same goes for quote unquote left leaning problems as well, that we would say need to be boldly stood up for, whether it's immigrants or the boats in Venezuela or whatever you want to talk about. There are times to talk about those things that seem obvious, but my main point is just that it's not easy, especially right now in 2025 with some of that as a pastor.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing to kind of end on that point, just because, I've really enjoyed this discussion. I feel like we've been nuanced. I think we've been fiery. I think we've been passionate, but it's all coming from a place that we really care about this stuff, even about this guy in particular, right? Because we've all spoken to in one way or another. He has positively impacted us, right? So whether or not, it's gone off the rails or whatever we would want to say, there's been a positive trajectory that has occurred due to our exposure to him. But I just really appreciate what you just said, Evan, about the humanity part of it. Like you just showing up here and being like, bros, it's hard to be a pastor now. It's hard to know what to say. It's hard to know what to speak to. What I'm trying to do in as eloquent and in gracious manner as possible is love people well and guide people away from idolatry the best that I can. And someone that knows you well, I think that you do in fact do that. So I'm just going to commend you live and for everyone to hear. But
I try.
you do. You don't try. There is no try. You do. I know that.
Another fun figure to look into sometime.
Yeah, Yoda. Oh my gosh, that'd be great. But yes, this has been our pod today. Great discussion. Hope y'all got something out of it. And yeah, that's that. See y'all next time. Peace. Hey y'all, Caleb here. Thank you for listening to our show today. Please like and subscribe wherever the heck you listen to pods, and make sure to follow us on all the socials at Influ-Men-Sirs. That is INFLU-men-Sirs. We'll see you next time. Peace.